So today we'll be discussing the sixth essay of Hans Jonas' Phenomenon of Life, titled "The Nobility of Sight: A Study in the Phenomenology of the Senses." And there's a lot of content in this essay. Even though it's only 10 pages, I feel like he covers quite a lot of content, and I've tried to cover all of it, but we'll have to move at a pretty steady pace to go through it. So I'll just get started straight away. The theme of the essay will be the senses, mainly vision, but he'll also focus on hearing and touch, and to a much smaller extent on smell. The approach is a phenomenology, so he will look at the experience of these senses, as opposed to, say, a more biological or anatomical analysis of how they work. So the method founded by Husserl. And the structure of this chapter is basically he identifies three different aspects of what makes sight unique, which he calls the image performance of sight. And he'll go into these three aspects, compare them across the senses in order to draw out what it is that makes vision special. And then finally, there's an appendix on movement, sight and movement. All right, so to start, the essay begins with taking us back to Greek philosophy, and basically saying that from back then already, we use visual metaphors to describe theory. So we say things like, do you see what I mean? We have words like insight, illuminating, enlightening. So all these words make some reference to vision. Also the notion of the eye of the soul, the light of reason. So vision has for already millennia been used as an analog for the intellectual upper structure. And it also serves as a model of perception in general. So we use vision as a sort of base sense to understand our other senses. But Jonas says vision is in fact a very special sense. It is firstly incomplete by itself, and its highest virtues are also its essential insufficiencies. So these are the things he will be going into this essay. So what is it that makes vision, that makes sight so special? It's what he calls the image performance. And this image performance he breaks down into three different aspects: simultaneity, neutralization, and distance. And each of these we will now be going over one by one. Let me just turn on a bit of light here. I have a bit more vision in my own room. All right, so to start with, simultaneity in the presentation of a manifold. So we see here an image of a room, and at a glance, we have an overview of the entire space, all the objects that are in it, right? We see everything at once. And this is one of these unique powers of vision. So sight is the sense of the simultaneous or the coordinated, or he also calls it the sense of the extensive. In opposition, all the other senses, they construct their perceptual unities out of a temporal sequence. So they're time-bound, they're non-spatial, and the content is always in the making. It's always partial, incomplete. And because of that, the other senses never achieve this detachment from the mode of existence of their object, from their own mode of existence. They're kind of tied to each other, while vision attains this distance and this detachment. So he goes into this point by comparing it with hearing and touch. So let's begin with hearing, right? So with sounds, basically hearing only gives us a dynamic and never a static reality. So a sound, he calls it a dynamic event at the locus of an object. And through that dynamic event, we get an idea of the state of the object at that moment. And from there, we understand that there is an object. So there we hear a bark, we understand, we recognize that as the bark of a dog. And from that, we know that there's a dog which is barking. And finally, we know that there's a dog. Now, all of this happens in one movement, in one process. but the object reference itself isn't provided by the sounds as such. It is what he calls a third step in the process of hearing. So because of this, sound is eminently suited to constitute a reality of its own, a sort of objectivity of acoustic values, because it doesn't have this immediate object reference. It kind of has its own domain where it can play around. And music is the best example of this. And the synthesis that happens with sound is it's a temporal process involving memory, right? So we always hear one note followed by another, and they're synthesized into a melody. So the acoustic object that is created in this manner is a time object, an object which spans some amount of time, a sequence. Now, you could say, isn't there an acoustic space? Right? For example, when you're at a cocktail party, there's many people talking. There's the ones talking close to you, the ones talking further away. There's layers of sound, just like you could say there's layers of visual objects. So isn't there a space of sound as well? Well, Jonas says this is a metaphor because the juxtaposition of plurality that takes place in the acoustic domain isn't a primary datum of the acoustic sphere. It is, in fact, a feat of ongoing organization. So, on the basis of Gestalt principles, our faculties of hearing pick out these strands. Like I try to represent it here a bit visually. You have one flux of a melody, and we're able to pick apart the different strands of this, and through that we get a sense of a space of sound. But in fact, the domain of sound itself is one sort of tissue, one tight-knit process. And it's not like the visual space where there's actually a plurality presented at once. So the final point he makes about sound is that sound intrudes upon a passive subject. So an example of this would be, someone is snoring and you can't sleep, you can't help it. Or earlier today when I was making this presentation, there were two other people talking at the table in front of me, and I couldn't focus. Like as much as I tried, the sound was really invading me and drawing my attention. So our eyes can wander, our ears cannot wander, and our freedom of selective attention is thereby very limited with hearing. So to conclude, hearing is bound to succession and not presenting a simultaneous coordinated manifold of objects. And in that way, it falls short of sight in respect to the freedom which it confers upon its possessor. So this is the comparison, firstly, with hearing, right? So the simultaneity of the image, we see the image at one glance. Hearing has its own distinct way, which doesn't have this property. So then he moves on to touch. There's different ways of in which touch presents itself. As a first approximation, he says that touch is similar to hearing in the sense that it's also successive in its apprehension. It's a time-bound process, but it's also similar to vision in the sense that it synthesizes static objects through this process. So touch itself is a blanket label here for a very complex set of functions. At the most elementary level, it's a contact sensation, right? You just feel something. And shape isn't a part of this. So shape isn't a part of the basic sensation of touch. Shape is something which emerges additively from a multiplicity of touch sensations together with proprioception. So what this means is that there is a synthesis that takes place on the part of the perceiver. So touch is also a time entity like sound, like I just mentioned. But what sets touch apart from hearing is that with this temporal process, you get an act of feeling, right? There's an active component, whereas sound was just intruding on you. With touch, you are actually moving your hand to feel something. And like this, you acquire a sense of the form of the object. And because of this, you get the co-presence of a space object. So there's a matrix of simultaneity like there is in vision. So touch has this combination of being temporally bound while also being able to present a static manifold. And he says that this real shape feeling is probably only something that the human hand can accomplish because it involves the image faculty. So it basically relies on the development of vision. And it's only because we can see objects like we can, like things that are independent of us, that through touch we can do something similar. And then he goes on to compare these analyses with sight. So as we said, all the other senses operate on the basis of a time series. Melody is a sequence. Touch includes a time element, but the sequence becomes irrelevant. It doesn't matter what you touch first and next. It just all synthesizes together in the object. While sight doesn't have this intrinsic reference to time. A color is just a color that's there given to you. It's not bound to time like touch is, or like melody is. So he concludes this with a very concise formula. Hearing is the presentation of sequence through sequence. Touch is the presentation of simultaneity through sequence. Sight, on the other hand, is a presentation of simultaneity through simultaneity. Is this pace good? Am I going too fast, or is this a good pace to go? Okay. So finally, he turns to the link with time, because this first part, he also calls it the time aspect of seeing. So this simultaneity of image, it allows us to compare and interrelate objects in the field, right? We don't only see many things at once, we see them in their mutual proportion. And this, he argues, lies at the root of objectivity. So it introduces us to the present as something that's more than a passing point, a passing now. It gives us a sense of the co-presence of things in one present that embraces them. So basically, the present becomes a dimension in our vision. We can scan the visual field like this room, we can scan all the objects, but what we see was already there in the first glance. So in that sense, the present, which comprises all the objects, is there as a dimension. And if something changes in the scene, that's when time starts rolling visually. He says I think that's a good way to put it. So as soon as something moves, that's when time also starts moving in that space. And because of this, he argues that vision is at the root of our dichotomy between the changing and the unchanging, between becoming and being. And in this sense, vision is at the root of the idea of the eternal. The eternal is basically an idealization of the present, which is given to us sensuously in vision. Okay, I think that is, then the final point he makes here is that this gives us a great biological advantage, because if we see a whole field of objects at once, then we also have a whole set of possibilities given at once. And this is a major factor in the freedom that we have as a self-moving animal. Okay, so that is the first aspect of vision, the simultaneity in the presentation of a manifold, and compared to touch and hearing. And then he moves on to the second property, which is neutralization of the causality of sense affection. So this is I tried to find an image that sort of can convey this, and this is the best I could do. So there's a person standing, gazing out, beholding a landscape. And this is only something we can do with our eyes. We don't behold a landscape with our ears or with our touch. It's something very visual. And it involves this neutralization, this I am here, it is there, and we're standing opposed to each other. So in seeing, I'm not yet engaged by the seen object, right? So this freedom of choice that I just talked upon, it also depends upon this unique power of vision. It lets me be as I let it be. Touch, on the other hand, is nothing but the entering into an actual intercourse with the object. So there's no separation in touch between the theoretical function of information gathering and the practical conduct which gathers that information. They're sort of, united into one movement. In sight, on the other hand, there is this split. And because of that, he argues that sight is also the organic root of our human distinction between theory and practice. Compare this again with hearing. In hearing, there's no doing on my part, but on the part of the object, there's a lot of doing. It intrudes into me, right? So things aren't by their nature audible as they are visible. Sound is an event. So it's not merely the existence of things, it's an event to which I'm bound as soon as it happens in a dynamical situation. And sight is precisely the absence of this binding, this dynamic situation that grabs hold of me. So there is, of course, a commerce that takes place, physically speaking, between light and the eye. But the unique aspect of vision is that this commerce doesn't play a part in the phenomenal result, is what he argues. So in this way, sight neutralizes the causality of the field. And this, he says, has a gain and a loss. So there's two sides to this power, two sides to this equation. The gain is the concept of objectivity, as he already mentioned before at the first aspect. So because of this neutralization, we are able to behold things as they are in themselves, as distinct from how they affect me. And this gives us a sense of theoretical truths. And through our imagination, we can then detach this image and contemplate the form as distinct from the matter, contemplate the essence as distinct from the existence. And this is at the bottom of abstraction, of all free thought, of science, scientific inquiry, understanding. So in this sense, vision is in fact at the root of our whole intellectual life. And these images, our imagination can simply vary them at will. And that is also, on a side note, the Husserlian Wesenschau, the intuition of essences, is basically based on vision, if you would take this into account. The loss here is exactly also what makes this possible. It is this elimination of the causal connection. So visual objects have this self-containedness towards the observer, which also reflects onto them as objects, and they become seen as self-contained entities in a spatial matrix. So he makes a reference here to Hume that we don't perceive the causal connections. There's a gap in the interconnectedness of things. So this is why sight is the freest of the senses, but also the least realistic of the senses. Because he claims reality is primarily evidenced in resistance, and sight doesn't have this notion of resistance. While touch experience is basically the sense which has it the most, because touch involves impact. And in touch, the perception of quality is blended with the experience of force. So in touch, we have the original encounter with reality as reality. It is the true test of reality. There's a few examples, tug of war is a true test of strength, right? You're pulling, and with your whole body, you're involved with it. Atlas holding the world, you have a weight on your shoulders. That's in a literal sense, the test of reality, right? And this image of, an illusion of a three-dimensional object, well, how do you find out if it's three-dimensional or not? You touch it and you feel that it's flat. So in this sense, touch becomes the test of reality. Sight can be much more easier to manipulate and to deceive sight. So the effortlessness of sight, which is its power, its virtue, at the same time forgoes the reward of the lower sense, which is in this case touch. And here he makes a number of claims, which I'll get back to in the discussion because I think they take things a bit too far. But how he puts them is seeing requires no perceptible activity on the part of object or subject, neither invades the sphere of the other, so they're both self-contained, and the perceiver remains free from this causal involvement. So vision is in this sense a standing back from the aggressiveness of the world, a becalmed abstract of reality denuded of its raw power. I think that the painting again exemplifies this, right? You're gazing onto the raw power of nature, but you're standing here gazing at it in your own autonomous sovereign space as a seer. So this is the second aspect of vision. Finally, he goes into distance. Distance in the spatial and mental sense, which is the final aspect of this image performance of sight. Here is a depiction of distance. We have objects staggered in depth that goes on, and we feel that whole space presented to us visually. So the first two powers, the first two aspects of vision presuppose this, right? The simultaneity of presentation, which was the first one, it wouldn't be possible if the visual manifold crowds my immediate proximity, if it's there blocking my space so that I can't see anything behind it. And this neutralization of causality wouldn't be possible if objects entered my private sphere. So both of them presuppose that the things we see are at a distance from us. So sight is this ideal distance sense. Sight is built for this because light, it travels faster than sound and smell, so it can traverse a much longer distance while remaining undistorted because the light particles, the photons, don't lose their accuracy over distance. And so how does this translate to vision? Well, to get the proper view of something, we take the proper distance, and that becomes a part of the visual exploration. It's not a insufficiency or a deficiency of the vision. It's in fact a part of what gives us information about the object, taking the right distance from it. Smell, on the other hand, and this is the only passing reference he makes to smell, it never gains, it always loses by distance. And with hearing, there can be an optimal distance, of course, but further withdrawal will not disclose new vistas to it, like with vision. And then he goes into the manner. This is what makes this power of distance in vision so unique. It's the way in which the distance is presented. It's actually presented in its steps. So the object faces me across this distance, and the whole plane is given to me. It's not just the object and a void. It's the entire space that takes me to the object. So the distance is there as an open dimension that I can traverse. And this object, this terminus, is arbitrary. So it has as a background all the other objects. So there's an open field surrounding it, behind it, besides it, and the whole space is in this way given to me at a distance. And this is the birthplace of the idea of infinity, he argues. So it's through vision that we get a sense of the infinite. Think about gazing at the night sky and literally looking upon the infinity of the cosmos. In touch, there is also, as we said, objects being presented, but there isn't this blending of the actual and the potential. With touch, you're always in contact with the actual. You always have a contact with something here and now. And you don't have this field of the possible touches behind it and besides it given to you at once. So this power of distance, once again, it gives us a tremendous advantage biologically because the knowledge at a distance is quite literally a foreknowledge. The increase in freedom that we get from it. So we get an increase in freedom because we get a time margin for action. We can see what's happening ahead of us, so we can plan ahead of time. So that, I think, concludes the three aspects. And he concludes his discussion of them by referring back to the start of the ancient Greeks and how they made reference to vision. So this wasn't for no reason, this wasn't in vain. Vision grounds some of these basic concepts of philosophy. So we have the simultaneity of presentation is what grounds our idea of an enduring present, and with that the distinction of change and unchanging, time and eternity, right? It's because we have the whole space given at a glance that we have a sense of a present that encompasses all of them. And if something changes in it, we can see the difference between the change and the unchanging. So in this sense, The simultaneity gives us an idea of eternity. The neutralization of causality is what enables us to consider essence as independent of existence. So we get a sense of form as independent of matter. And this is what is at the root of the distinction between theory and practice. And finally, as we just said, through distance, we get an idea of infinity. Okay, so this was the main block of the text, the three aspects that he discusses. And then finally, there is an appendix on sight and movement. So what he says there, so basically throughout this essay, he doesn't really talk too much about the body, which I also thought was a bit, I also was scratching my head, like, where is the body? And then obviously he returns to it in the appendix. So he says that the motility of the body is a core factor in all of this, in the constitution of seeing and of the seen world. And it is what we call the share of praxis. And then he goes through a little historical overview of how this concept has developed, starting with Kant. For Kant, the active component of our being was purely mental activity. So Kant had a view that is very opposed to towards his conception, at least, and towards the contemporary embodied conceptions of vision. So for Kant, it's a theoretical subject that constructs the perceptual world from sense data. And the practical subject is something that the theoretical subject becomes through a need or through moral will. And that's why basically the practical subject acts in and on the world that is already constituted by sense and reason. So with Kant, there's a separation between this theoretical subject and praxis, and there is an understanding of sense knowledge as being very passive and receptive, something that your intellect receives and then uses to construct a world. Moving on from Kant, we get to Berkeley. Berkeley involves touch into the equation. He says that our object perception and its spatial framework result from a mental integration of these, of sight and touch. But then Jonas nuances this by saying that the touch here involves motion. More specifically, it involves intentional or directed motion. Here makes, I think, an interesting point. It's purposive. It's only a purposive act. It's only as a purposive act that movement contributes vitally to the organization of a perceptual world. So this is where intentionality comes into the equation. So it is my reason for movement that actually gives the framework of coordinates into which these touch sensations are integrated. So I don't randomly move across an object. I move with it with a reason, with an intention, with a purpose. And it is that purposeful movement that forms the framework into which these touch sensations become lodged and integrated. And my body there is a sort of central reference system. So yeah, I think this is the last point he makes there. But he says, didn't we say that vision is in fact the sense of the passive observer par excellence? Aren't we now contradicting all of this by adding motion into it and this active movement? He says, actually, this distinction still stands. Touch is indeed the sense of the passive observer, but we wouldn't see if we had not previously moved. So the background of non-visual corporeal feeling and our accumulated experience of movement is essential to seeing the world. So it's only on the background of all of this that we are able to neutralize the causality and behold the world as a spectacle. So in this sense, vision is integrated into your whole body, but is able to perform this intellectual sight, this insight into the world, only on the basis of that understructure of corporeality. Okay, so this is the main discussion of the chapter and the appendix. Then I have a few notes for ending it. So what I thought was especially interesting and good about this essay was, so the main thing he does here, right, a comparative phenomenology of the senses, vision, hearing, and touch. I think it's especially interesting how he involves hearing and touch. It's not something I've read a lot, like a detailed investigation into hearing, and comparing them with each other and drawing out their differences in this way. Especially studying Merleau-Ponty, there's a immense focus on vision, and these other senses are a bit more on the sideline. So this, I feel, gives a more richer, fuller picture, fills in a bit of the blanks. And one of the main things he's demonstrating throughout this essay is how vision underlies the intellect, how it underlies ideality. So both of these are, I think, quite valuable, quite well done in this essay. And now one critical note that I want to end with is what I feel he left out is the gaze. So in a nutshell, I feel like vision itself is idealized in his conception. And it's especially this little piece on the part on dynamic neutralization that I was mentioning, I would come back to. So he says seeing requires no perceptible activity on the part of the subject or object, and both are in their own sphere as self-contained object and subject. Now I sense I didn't agree with this because of my background of studying Merleau-Ponty and what Merleau-Ponty was making me aware of. So Merleau-Ponty describes vision as a palpation of the visible by the gaze. And this, I think, builds it's a different conception. It's a much more involved conception that we get of how vision works. So to exemplify this, I have a small quote from The Visible and the Invisible. The look, we said, envelops, palpates, espouses the visible things, as though it were in a relation of pre-established harmony with them, as though it knew them before knowing them. It moves in its own way with its abrupt and imperious style, and yet the views taken are not desultory, which is to say random. So I do not look at a chaos, but at things, so that finally one cannot say if it is the look or if it is the things that command. So basically, Merleau-Ponty is pointing out that there is a kinship, an affinity between your gaze and the visible. They work together as one unity. They're intertwined with each other. So if we draw the gaze into the equation, which is to say, if we actually notice how vision takes place from moment to moment, we notice that there's a strong binding between your gaze and the visible spectacle. Right? You don't just look at a chaos, you trace the contours of things. You cannot help but trace them. I think a good example is if you just move your head from left to right, your eyes don't stay fixed. They kind of jump from one thing to the other, and you can't help but doing that. And the only way you can stop that is by sort of forcibly holding your eye muscles still and moving your head. So if you just naturally move your head, you jump from thing to thing. So that demonstrates that vision is in fact quite tied to the visible, and they don't remain independent of each other as a subject and object. They do invade each other's sphere. They hold each other in a sense. And in this sense, vision is in fact more similar to touch than Jonas here presents, I would argue. So I would say that if we involve the gaze into the equation, vision doesn't become this abstract of reality anymore. If we notice how your gaze itself is in a sort of relation with the visible and how it's bound to it, there's a bruteness, a sort of a raw power of reality that starts to show itself there, where your vision isn't simply objectively, neutrally seeing the world. That's the conception we get from it once we idealize this process and split it apart and consider them both in their own sphere. But actually, they encroach on each other. So that would be one critical note. It doesn't take away from the good insights of this whole essay, but I did want to end with this little nuance. And with that, that concludes my presentation. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts and reflections on this. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent presentation of a short but very dense part of the book. Okay, and also, of course, it's great that you raised some questions already. I think we'll probably start the discussion with those. So does anyone have any comments?
Yeah, about the vision part, so the Merleau-Ponty part. It's interesting that you had this impression as if the account that he was giving in the body of the text was an idealized one. The way I saw it was that it was basically an account of a way that, for instance, in everyday experience, people would just see things. You know, the Merleau-Ponty account, it's not something that if you were, you know, to talk to a regular Joe or Jane about things, that he was trying to capture that particular moment. And I think that that's the reason why he added the appendix, where he basically, in a certain sense, said that he would probably go in the direction of what you were saying, that there's like this way more intricate interrelationship. But the overall account that he was trying to portray is just the way you usually use a certain sense modality, and without necessarily reflecting upon it as to the background, you know.
Yeah, I guess the reason why I got that impression is it's the language he uses. So I would have liked to have this more nuanced feeling from it, but let me just share the one slide again for a moment.
Yeah.
So it's the language he uses there. It's he says no, I don't think I have the word here, but he says basically that they are entirely free. He kind of uses quite an extreme language there, that there is no activity on either part and they are entirely free from each other. I feel like maybe if he used a bit more of a nuanced language, that it's not entire and absolute, then I would have a more favorable reading of his interpretation there. But it's because of this absolute language that he uses there that I felt like it was lacking a bit of nuance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the way I can understand, you know, how you would get to this particular reading and understanding. For me, it was just like, this is how I understood that he was basically trying to underscore things in how vision is in a certain sense given to you in your everyday experience. And that then there's also another aspect of it. And this is also something that Merleau-Ponty is emphasizing, but is kind of hinting to that he would like to develop but never managed to. So when you're talking about vision, you have a kind of twofold project. One project is trying to show in what way it has a certain anchorage that is usually overlooked. So when you're talking about this visible and the seeing and the seeing being intermeshed and all of that, which is usually overlooked. But there is also something that differentiates vision from touch, and that makes it very, 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 very open to what ultimately becomes the domain of the intellect. So, you know, not only in the Greek philosophy, but for example, when you read the classical Buddhist texts, the early Buddhist texts, for instance, you know, when they would talk about insight, they would describe it as clear, as luminous, you know. So they usually, what you have is like these very, very visual metaphors for these accounts. So I think that for me personally, this was, like you said at the beginning of your end summary, there's something really, for me, this chapter is extremely, extremely valuable. It was even, personally, it was even more interesting for me than the previous one. The previous one is more well known. Usually it's tackled more often because of the topic, but for me, there is a certain, I don't know, richness and value to this depiction. One thing that I would like to ask, and maybe, you know, Atul, maybe you could kind of provide some reflections and others as well. One thing that I felt I would really, really wish that Jonas did was to include, for example, at least the sense of smell. Taste, interesting, but smell would be really, really interesting to me, you know? So I don't know, what would be your impressions of how could smell fit into this this structure that we've delineated?
Feeling like, why is smell always left out of these accounts? Yeah, like in phenomenology, smell and taste are never really addressed. It feels like maybe because they're the most strange of the senses. And then, yeah, that set me off on some reflection also of what makes smell so unique, and taste also. I think they're the most tied to the body in a way. They're the most tied to the body's own functions and the least to the world. So that they are, in a sense, the most concerned with the body's well-being. That's at least a feeling that I had. At least taste is, because it's already inside your body, so it has to be very sensitive to your own body state. And yeah, the information that it provides about the object is very much in relation to you, and in relation to what makes you thrive or what makes you comfortable, and much less in relation to simply the way the things are or the way events happen around you. So I guess this could be a starting point of a phenomenology of smell or taste.
What was particularly interesting to me with regards to the smell, this emphasis on the diffusion and the background. So, with the smell, what's so interesting is that very often it has like a very the objective domain is very, very minimal, and the horizontal aspect is very pronounced. So this atmospheric element of smell is very interesting. It's like, it really it is way much more strongly related to the Heideggerian Stimmung, yeah, and to his mood, so to speak, which kind of just open you up, they disperse you, so to speak, and it's very diffuse. I mean, it can be in a certain sense focused, but only if it's in a certain sense usually accompanied by something else. The first element is more like you're kind of put into a certain state, into a certain place. So when I was thinking about this, it's almost as if with vision, what you get is you have an objective segment which is related to the touch part. It is that which allows you to kind of grasp a certain figure. But then you have the element of the background, which is like more related to the smell. It's almost as if you had a weird modality that manages to kind of integrate these two aspects. So you are able to have the atmospheric and something against which something presents itself. I mean, I know it doesn't work that way, but it's just the feeling that I got, because with the smell, you have this very diffuse, this dispersed atmospheric domain element, and then with touch, like you said, it's something that is very anchored into something, and to the very strong degree where it really provides, like the doubting, what's his name, Thomas, right? Is that how you say it in English? Dvomechi Tomasz Adnan.
Who are you talking about?
Yeah, well, the figure from the Bible who was doubting whether Christ has truly arisen and had
That would
to
be
touch
Thomas.
the wound.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does one say doubting, or I think that it's a different, but the figure that I'm talking about, the he had to touch the wounds. It's a very good exemplification of what you said, of the reality of things, because the vision can deceive you. But I don't know. This is something I found interesting.
Yeah, for this question of reality, I had a question reading the chapter. By the way, thanks for the presentation too. It was great and beautiful with the images. But I had this question: the difference between objectivity and reality, the fact that objectivity is not very realistic. He says in the chapter that it's a game to have the concept of objectivity. Sight gives this to us, and it is a game. But at the same time, he's saying that's not very realistic. So I had this question: why would it be a game to have something that is not very realistic?
My initial thoughts to that are that realism here is associated with the direct, immediate contact that takes place, and vision is the most removed from this immediate contact. And it's because it's removed from that that it's able to gain a sort of an objective overview of the things. So its distance is at the same time what gives it its clarity and its insight.
Yeah, I was wondering if this game is a game in terms of survival again, because we gain a certain time to react to a threat and things like that, but not necessarily because it gives us more truthful view of reality.
Then would that mean science is making us more and more distance from the truth of reality, in a sense? I guess in a sense, yeah. Right? In a sense, scientific truth takes us away from the immediate truth.
No, but this is actually really a good question, because it's also possible. Because it would seem that with regards to touch, I mean, what he says is like this effort and resistance, yeah? And with the sight, you kind of lose this element. But on the other hand, with the capacity of the, so to speak, objectivity, and I'm not just speaking like in a narrow sense, but just this capacity to modulate and shift perspectives, you know, to switch and change, like a very profound depth of reality opens up, you know, even though it can easily trick you, but on the other hand, it definitely opens up layers of depths, of new depths.
Mm-hmm.
So this is
I was avoiding to say that it's a false view. It's not false, but it's not realistic. So it's different. I agree. It can be.
It's a paradox of vision, right? That it's like these two things that it combines. It's a sort of a paradox that's inherent to vision, that its distance from reality is what gives it an insight into reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that in a certain sense makes sense, because the less you are submerged in it, the more you're able to, well, not only the more, but even at all, you're able to know it in this particular sense, because you're able to, first of all, recognize it as such, because you're not submerged in it. Yeah, this is an interesting one. So, any further thoughts on this?
When we in activist approaches, when we talked about experience, we tend to make some relation to touch more than sight. It's concrete. We need to move. We need to, and there's this idea that objectivity is something. The separation between subject and object can be put into question. We are not looking to the co-emergence of things when we are in the domain of purely objectivity.
Yes, but the thing that one of the issues that is bugging me with regards to this is that what then sometimes happens is that the distinctions that are valuable become undermined. So you basically get seeing modeled on touching, which is wrong. It's not correct to do this. I mean, if you try to, so for example, if we go back to the Merleau-Pontian stance, his point of view or attempt to approach this, and Jonas seems to be doing this also, although we have to admit, like, there's an essay and then he added an appendix, so he's not doing it very like clearly. He didn't really integrate this into a whole, and they're of course missing accounts as to, you know, how these things are fully integrated and connected. So but the impression is that, you know, if you want to really understand, for example, sight, is you need to be mindful of its roots, but you also have to be mindful of how it kind of sublimates and then transcends these roots. So you have to be able to account for sight as sight. Sight is not touch, even though it has certain dimensions of touch. So it's definitely valuable to have these accounts, but there's also something, you know, very distinct and unique in this capacity to open you up into something that then eventually can become your capacity to contemplate an object. And this is not to be trivialized, you know, it can easily become trivialized. And last time, I think we very briefly talked about, I think that the reason why this is getting such bad reputation, and, you know, in my early reflections and writings as well, I was being way too simplistic with regards to this, is that you just have this weird conflation of thinking in the broad sense of the term and instrumentalized thinking, which has become kind of conceived of in certain continuations of what happened with the early modern philosophy. I wouldn't say that this is true for Descartes, but then later on, when you get like this idea of thinking just being what is sometimes referred to as manipulation of symbols, basically, you know, something that is an algorithm, this then becomes a problem. And, you know, you somehow see that this necessarily exhausts the whole domain of thinking. I think that this is wrong. This is just an overtly narrow way of conceiving of the mind and the intellect, and it's simply false. It's just something that is not okay. So, you know, how does one go about doing these dialectical pirouettes where you are able to account for the roots, but also are mindful of that which takes it, you know, above? I think that, yeah, this is something that I sometimes am missing in activist accounts.
You say then that there's two senses of truths that emerge there, like because Jonas says that touch is the primary contact with reality. So if we say that touch there gives us the most immediate access to reality, it would be the most immediate access to truths. So, but if vision takes a distance from that and has its distant access to reality, is there a sort of yeah, does reality sort of emerge twice as in two different spheres? That
I would be careful with regards to this. So, you know, like, it's very easy to fall into conflating notions such as the immediacy and the reality in this particular sense, in the sense of the immediate, and truth. I don't think that you can have truth at the level of the senses. You really need to get to the level of mindedness, which is related to language, to be able to speak of truth, regardless of how it is conceived. And there again, you can kind of have an interesting debate about, you know, what does it mean? Is it like a, you know, just something within the domain of the propositional, or something that is more related to the Heideggerian of opening? But Heidegger is also adamant, you need speech for that. You know, if as long as you're in the domain of Umwelt, and this is basically something that would be somehow related to the senses, and in human beings you never have that, because you're always a minded being. You can never just be like sense being, unless you have a really strong deformity, and then there's probably no truth for you. You don't have access to the world in this regard. But yeah, so you basically need this. And also, you know, I was also thinking, so we kind of presuppose that this idea that touch is something that is kind of the immediate access to the world. And it is true that with us, we usually gravitate to touch. But for example, in dogs or something, they will smell it. they will smell it. And my brother, for some reason, when he was young, he liked to smell everything. So for him, he kind of naturally gravitated towards that.
Yes,
Yeah, I don't know, you know, I don't have answers to this. It's just like a very, that's why I find this chapter so interesting. It lays out some interesting analysis, and then it's just like wide open.
So I'm very curious to know actually what like the main reflections were of the others while reading this.
Yeah.
I just add regarding smell, one interesting thing that I might get this wrong since this is just remembering something that I heard on a podcast, but apparently people can learn to track scents fairly well, surprisingly well, and also to differentiate smell by directionality. So to know without moving whether it's coming more from the left or from the right, because we have two nostrils. So yeah, smell can be a bit more, how to put it? I mean, I know that they did some interesting studies on that. People, I think they only trained them, which is an interesting expression here, seeing that they're basically trained to track scents. So I think they only had like a day or something of training, and like they were really, really incredibly good. So that's one thing. And about touch, I suppose one thing is that touch is in a way even more closely intertwined with our kinesthetic sense of the body than is any other sense, because we can have a perfectly good kinesthetic sense of where we are without seeing and also without hearing, even though the kinesthetic part is part and parcel of seeing. So seeing requires kinesthetic awareness, but it's not the other way around. Whereas with touch, even though, of course, how many senses are there, to what extent is like proprioception, interoception different, etc. There's a huge question there. But at any rate, it seems inconceivable that one could have any kind of kinesthetic awareness that is sort of fundamental to being in any kind of perceptive situation without the sense of touch. We can't abstract touch away from that the way we can other senses. So that, and also one thing I found interesting when he talks about hearing. So he says that the object reference of sounds is not provided by the sounds as such, and it transcends the performance of mere hearing. All indications of existence, etc., are extraneous to their own nature. So his treatment of hearing is something that I found a bit odd. I don't know. I don't know if Merleau-Ponty mentions that anyway, but I think his notion, which seems to be that hearing does not involve the indication of an existent being in the same way that sight does, is a bit strange, because people who are blind from birth are obviously no less inclined to believe in the existence of enduring things in the world than are the rest of us. So that's also something that I would assume Merleau-Ponty would treat a bit differently, because I don't know. Of course, it's hard. He's not completely systematic and thorough about these things, so it's not necessarily that he has in mind hearing as something that requires some kind of a additional, maybe even kind of rational discursive ascription of existence. Probably not that. But at any rate, it's a bit odd. So I know there's a whole mess of things in what I just said. So if anyone wants to tie into any bit of that.
Yeah, I found what you said about smell very interesting. One thing that, crossed my mind as you were saying this is that it's almost as if, you have each sense modality as if it gravitated towards its own way of expressing itself. And then, of course, you can cultivate it and you can train it. So, for example, like you said, you can train people to either trace and recognize distinctions and whatnot, But the way it is usually given to you, it is like, you know, it is given in this open, more diffuse, more dispersed. And I don't mean by that just, you know, that it's kind of all over the place, but it's more, really more mood related sense, it would seem. It is, you know, something that really kind of provides this synchronization on a very open level. And of course, then you can do different things with it. And you can do different things with sites. For example, you know, site will usually gravitate, once it's constituted properly, towards what Jonas is describing, where you have this impression, I'm here, the object is there. But you can learn to look at it differently. You can learn to recognize yourself looking at things, and you see things having a certain horizon and background. You normally wouldn't see these aspects, but you can kind of train yourself to do it. So what I'm trying to say is that, you know, you can do different types of things with the senses. They have like a very specific, it would seem to me, way of gravitating towards a certain modality. Now, maybe I'm wrong. I don't really know. And of course, it's like a very much related to the social context, ultimately, in the sense of that, you know, given the values of the milieu in which you are raised, and how people around you behave, you might start differently. From the very early age, you might start using smell in this particular sense. Yeah, so I'm not trying to, maybe you can also see things very differently, I don't know. But yeah, that was just something that crossed my mind, you know, that you said that a lot of things can be done with the smell, and I found this very interesting. But I still have the impression it's like, yeah, you have to learn to be able to do it in this way, just like you can learn to see differently, whereas you gravitate towards a certain mode of seeing. Now, to what degree, yeah, this is like something that is, say, related to the normativity that is present in the culture, I don't really know. It's an interesting question, I guess.
The article that you posted, Letitia?
Oh,
Letitia,
yeah, I just sent an article I read a long time ago. It was an article by Latour. It's not directly related to what we are discussing here, but he uses this example of the training of smells, the creation of people that call themselves the noses, because they are very able to make differences and create distinctions between smells that for most of us we don't perceive. And he uses this example to talk about the normativity in science. So I just sent the link.
Also made me think, is smell the only sense which is directly also entangled with a very different organic function, which is that of breathing? Right, like
no, but taste also to a certain degree. Taste and smell, and they're usually, very often, they're treated as interrelated. So they're, you know, how these, I don't know, maybe you will know this because you're kind of more in touch with the current podcasts and these things. But isn't there like an idea that basically, or some sort of a claim was made that smell and taste are basically one, that you smell by tasting or something? Isn't there something like that?
I don't know about the podcast, but I think that was
no, not necessarily the podcast.
I mean, even in like pop science 15 years ago, something I remember it. So, you know, it was a big, fairly popular claim that, you know, like if you, I don't know, even if you just plug your nose, you can barely distinguish anything, you know, by taste alone. Like taste alone just gives you a very little data, essentially. So that idea that those two are kind of combined, I think, yeah, is a bit older.
Yeah, for sure. I just meant that, you know, because usually in these more popular venues you get these things constantly dished out. That's what I meant by that, of course, but there's like a theory behind it that goes way back. An interesting thing is that clearly taste is the biggest loser here, right? Even we are not particularly interested in taste. So we kind of all gravitated towards this darn smell thing, but taste is just like, and now Adnan even said, yeah, if you exclude the smell, you know, it's basically nothing. So I don't know, what do we do with that? What do we do with taste?
I mean, yeah, it probably makes sense to say that sort of, you know, at the level of experience, everyday experience, those two senses aren't really separate the way certain other senses are.
Are they? Sensory motor loop and all of that?
Yeah, it's a difference of degree, I think, because of course all the other ones are also not completely separate, vision and touch being one very interesting pair. But I don't know. I'd say the taste and smell are even more interrelated. I mean, I remember having when was it? The first time I had COVID, I had basically the only major sort of, how to put it, the only thing that was there was an actual hindrance to my daily life in the aftermath of that, and it lasted for months, is that I completely lost the sense of smell for about, I don't know, a good month. And that meant that literally anything I ate, I still had taste. And that's a good way of isolating the two, because I could still taste salty or sweet, but that was pretty much it. So, you know, and sour, like, you know, those five basic tastes. It was as if everything that I ate could only be some combination of those five basic tastes with no additional information. You know, it's like eating salty cardboard or sweet cardboard. You know, there's the amount of variation that you get. And also some changes in smell, which lasted even longer, and it took like half a year for that to completely sort of dissipate. So it was strange, a good way of isolating the two, essentially, and probably a way that I'm probably not the only one, because it's a fairly common thing to happen with COVID.
Anna, but now that you were describing this, an interesting idea popped up in my mind. So we were talking about, you know, smell providing like this atmosphere or a more horizontal thing, but then you have taste, which is related to tongue, and in a certain sense it's kind of similar to touch, where it has like this direct contact and it's more focused, when we said that this is something that is more related to figure. So basically when you eat, what you need is like something that is given against a certain background. You have a smell which embeds a certain something that is very direct into a certain larger sphere. And again, you have vision combined in a, yeah, what sight can do for you, where you have like a certain figure against a certain ground, is provided here by having literally two of these senses work together, where you have a muscle, some sort of touch that has a specific type of sensibility, which is very direct. Like you said, it has like these specific qualitative ways of responding, but they are meaningless if they're not given against a certain larger whole. So it is only when they're given against a certain horizon that really what becomes like the world of food opens up properly, where you really have like, you know, strawberry flavor and the spicy things and whatnot. You know, prior to that, it's just like almost as if you force yourself to see just sheer sensations or qualities, yeah, without any depth or background or texture or what have you. So this is something that I found out interesting, you know, that it is like this integration of these two, and then of course also sight and touch.
Yeah,
which is ultimately, yeah.
My experience with COVID, I had that too, the loss of the smell, but just for 3 days, and it was awful. And I felt that my sense of touch was impaired, actually, because I had, for example, creams that I knew that the smell, the perfume, and I had them in my hand and I couldn't smell. and I had the impression that I wasn't touching the thing. And I tried to feel the smell moving the cream in my hand, and it wasn't working. So I realized that for me, touch and smell are very, very connected.
Yeah, I guess like Adnan says, it's only a degree of like relative, I'm not sure what words you use, but like relative separation and differentiation, but they're all sort of entangled with each other. I guess talking about them in this way of like vision, hearing, and touch gives us a wrong impression of each as their own distinct sphere, while really it's one body possessing all these faculties in sort of an organically intertwined system.
Atul, what I really found interesting is what you said about the smell and the breath. Because breath, breath like gets way too short shrift. It's literally the most foundational rhythm of vitality. As not maybe always, but in a certain sense, yes, in some sort. It depends on how you define it. But if you think about it, your own corporeality, its foundational rhythm is tied to breath. And even these strong connections between words for breath and psyche and then spirit, it's just that there's so much to unravel there. But then having something like smell, which, like I said, has this very strange capacity to, and it's known that it's evolutionary, also the oldest, right? And it also, the way it is positioned in the nervous system is such that it kind of it is separate from the other pathway, so it's more like direct in the sense of what gets there, if I'm not mistaken. I forgot this part a little bit, but it's just you do sense, without neuroscience telling you this, there's something very primordial about it, and we all have these experiences where, for instance, in the autumn, you just go out on a walk and there's this peculiar smell of autumn, and all of a sudden, just the mood you find yourself in, there's just strange, almost like primordial or primeval longing. You don't even get it. It's almost as if some fiber in you gets moved. You cannot understand it. There's this weird nostalgia that you really have the impression goes like eons back. You don't even know what it refers to or what it relates to, and it's just like this faint, distinct smell, and it's immediately there. And I find this very fascinating. It has to do with it is the most closely related to the breath, to the foundational rhythm. So I really like that you kind of pointed this out. It's fairly obvious, but yeah.
While you were saying this, my thoughts were like, in a way, smell is like piggyback riding on breathing, right? Like smell requires breathing, but breathing doesn't require smell.
True that, yeah, true.
Like it's like lodged in the zone where breathing happens, and kind of exploits the breathing to use to utilize its own function.
It's interesting. It's almost as like the first. Today we're kind of going really into speculative waters, hardcore. If anybody's going to listen to this, they were just like, what are they on about? But it's interesting that it's almost as if smell were the first differentiator of the foundational rhythm of breathing, because you kind of have this foundational rhythm that has its kind of frequencies and whatnot, and that with the smell, what happens is like these first colorings can occur, first layers of, I don't know, quality added to that particular rhythm. This I find maybe also interesting.
I think that probably has to do with a couple of other things about smell. One of them being that smell is also kind of most closely connected to memory in a way. There's also some neurophysiology behind that, but forgot all about that. But I just faintly remember that there is. But also, experientially, it's quite obvious that a smell can evoke a decades-old memory much better than any other sense can, and very spontaneously. And the other thing is that, given what you were describing about smell being the first differentiation, that makes sense in light of smell's association with memory, not just memory, but in particular affectivity, because those memories often tend to be linked to strong affective states, and not just memories, like you described the scent of I don't know, of autumn, of a forest, of whatever. It does seem to have kind of a very deep primal connection to affective states, which makes it all the more puzzling that it's in a way the easiest sense to lose temporarily. And losing smell for half a year will it will drive you half mad. I can say that. So
yeah, maybe
But
Atul can then explain also the neurophysiology. But yeah, go on, Letitia, go on.
No, it was just another, considering that we are speculating. Now that Adnan mentioned memory and affectivity, I had this question reading the chapter regarding present, objectivity, and then time and memory and subjectivity. Because he presents in the chapter objectivity being related to this frozen time, this static in the present. And then I was wondering if this has some indication that time was related to subjectivity. And now that Adnan mentioned affectivity and memory, this came back.
Here, I would just say that he, I think he would say that affectivity is related to time in one of the previous essays, but regarding objectivity, I think, again, the way he describes it in relation to sight is to me it seemed a bit too narrow. Because again, it's not as if people who are born blind don't have that idea. In a way, I think what he's missing, what would make his account a bit more systematic, would be something like the notion of the intentional arc as something that sort of can unify these different domains in a way. Because again, he's not terribly systematic, so it's way too easy to just take a particular sentence and take it at face value and say, okay, this is problematic. But in any case, to me, it seemed that he sort of ties it up too closely to sight, as if sight is the only way we have of having some kind of a experiential grip on simultaneity, which it is clearly not. It is a unique way of beholding simultaneous objects, sure, but it can't be the only way, at any rate.
The thing is that what I think he's trying to say is that it is the one that gets you the closest to what you need to then have like this capacity of reasoning in terms of objects, because there's just something very powerful in this, the fact that you kind of open your eyes and you gaze at a certain object, and you have the capacity to just gaze at it. Whereas, for example, with sight or smell, and even with touch, there's a certain limitation. With sight, with sound, if it kind of stops emitting something, you really are lost, and not much you can sometimes do about it. And smell, the same thing. Even worse, smell really can be just like really all over the place. With touch, what he's trying to say is like much closer, but the problem is you don't get this feeling of having it at the same, like, given at the same time in different modalities. So you're always, in a certain sense, limited to where you are in the project of the exploration. So sure, you're kind of, that it is an object because you're kind of moving with it, and you learn to recognize it. and also with the sound, of course, the same thing, right? But it is not given in a certain sense in this continuity that you get with the capacity to kind of really stabilize the moment, to anchor. This anchoring moment of sight, I think, is like really, really profound. The capacity to not start with change and then elucidate the stability, but somehow once you acquire the capacity to see, you basically always, in a certain sense, start with stability against which then things are given that move. Yeah, so this is kind of interesting what it allows you to do in this regard. Whereas with other things, you always have this change in which you then have to get to a certain something that is stable. It is given to you through that. But here, at least after a while, once you become a proficient seer, you know, you kind of open your eyes and the world seems to be stable, and then something moves, and this is what, you know, draws your attention. And interesting thing, of course, you're constantly shifting your eyes to be able to do this. But the thing is that the trick of the vision is the recognition in a certain sense that something very new and important and significant from both biological perspective and then later on in not strictly biological sense can happen if you switch those two around, so that you don't use the movement to get to the object, but basically to something stable, so the activity, but that you actually phase out the activity to seemingly start from the stable. And then, of course, you can get to the back to the activity, of course, and you also recognize things that change and so on and so forth.
But you know, there's an implication of that. Like, if given that I have no reason to believe that people who are born blind, completely blind, have any kind of a different fundamental ontology in their experience, it's not the actual occurrence of sight. Maybe, you know, even someone who is born blind as a minded being, in a way, has a relationship to the world that is in a way structured according to sight, which seems a bit strange, but I think it makes sense.
Alan, I don't think that it's necessarily structured according to sight. I would say that it is structured according to mind, structured according to reason or intellect. The thing is that you have to be a visible being in order maybe for mindedness to develop. But just like there is the distinction between, say, touch and sight, you know, and there might be certain similarities, but then something opens up that kind of opens up a whole different domain. The same with mindedness. And as a human being, you might lack something like empirically or factually, but still, as a whole, the way that you're structured as a being that tends towards, regardless of how some people might find this aversive, but tends towards the mindedness, you are kind of tending towards the minded world as well. So even though you factually cannot see, it's not necessarily a hindrance. The bigger problem is you can have all the senses, but you don't have access to the social, cultural, minded world. And despite having all the senses, you know, like with the feral children and whatnot, you remain in a certain sense never fully developed, and you cannot recover once you pass a certain stage. And this is something that is now very well established. It is impossible to recover that. So you basically have all the functioning senses and all in that particular sense, but it's not about having the factual sense or not. It's just, I think that what Jonas is doing is in what sense is, for example, the creature that is visible, that has the capacity to vision likely to, you know, kind of eventually open up into possibly into a minded domain, or why is minded domain, why is the domain of the mind or intellect or reason so strongly tied to vision? Why do we use the vision metaphors so profusely? And why are they so frequent?
I have 2 points here. One of them being, structured according to sight was a bit of a strong expression. A better way, structured according to mind, but mind being here something that potentially includes sight. And that means that a human being who is born blind and grows up in a normal social environment is in a way closer to true sight than a feral child or an animal that has fully functioning visual system. And also, of course, it highlights the difference between sight in the human sense and animal vision. I think Jonas somewhere talks about the difference between what is it? Memory in man and animals. I think it's Erinnerung versus Gedächtnis or something like that in German. And something analogous in a way would have to be true of sight, because given the difference between world and environment that we talked about so many times over the past, well, since the first meeting probably, the variability of perspective and the interchangeability of subject and object in our view of the world, that seems kind of interwoven with our capacity of sight. So in a way, that relationship to the world is not something that we sort of add on mentally, but it's rather given in vision. So, you know, a very Heideggerian way of putting it would be that animals don't see, you know, only man sees, essentially.
Well, yeah, I know what you mean. I think that there could be a useful, I mean, it could be useful to introduce some sort of an terminological distinction. I don't know, maybe something along the lines of sight and spectacle could be useful or something like that. I don't know what the proper, because you know, it's not really important, but I see what you mean. So because seeing in a human being is ultimately related, as Jonas says in the appendix. So, you know, eyes are just part of your overall body and your overall intentionality towards the world. And now I think that one of the biggest mistakes here is that once you recognize that corporeality plays an important role, then all of a sudden you take this too narrowly. But if we go to Merleau-Ponty, one of the things that I found so very, very illuminating in phenomenology of perception, he says there are different ways of being a body. You know, there are different ways of being a body. He's being very explicit that, for example, in human beings, there is a very specific way of being a body. I would call this a minded way of being a body. So even a sight, of course, is because your mode of existence, your way of projecting towards the world is, you know, specifically structured. The dynamic is unique. The vision will be unique. And like you said, it is more important in this regard, even if you don't have sight, if you're embedded in the cultural milieu that allows you to develop this capacity, you're able to see better than the person that has the physiological organs intact, but runs with the wolves, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it makes sense to suppose that smell isn't that strongly differentiated. You know, the sight, with its sort of implication of a specific world relation, seems to be more different in man versus in animals than, for example, smell. You know, it's hard to see why smell in man would be qualitatively richer in any kind of particular way than, especially than the smell, I don't know, of dogs, you know, which are, of course, in a completely different playing field. But sight is somehow, and that again ties into Jonas's whole point on its exceptionality, essentially more differentiated, precisely because it ties up to mindedness in a more direct way, maybe.
Yes, and also with regards to what we were saying about the smell and its relationship to the affectivity and moods. You know, the sight does not have this capacity that pronounced, and this capacity to have this disentangled somewhat, the capacity to not get fully absorbed. I have the impression that, you know, with the smells, what you get is differentiation of the type of a blocking. You know, once you're in an event, you have a differentiation which basically draws a line in the sense of being in something and then not having, you know, necessarily additional differentiations within that. In the same sense, whereas with the sight, what you get is like this differentiation that has a lot of different possible angles and perspectives that you can take on. But with the sound, with the smell, you're more engrossed in the differentiation that occurs. You know, it's just like it's very strongly related to which affectivity will be evoked and then how you will be anchored into that particular moment. With sight, there is a greater openness in the sense of also how you're going to position yourself with regards to this, you know. And I have a huge problem that once you start kind of, you know, demonizing the domain of the intellect and the reason and also then sight and everything, you're kind of going in this direction as if just, yeah, we have to be, you know, more anchored into the reality. I mean, yeah, but depends on what you mean by that. If you're developing stronger awareness of these dimensions that you tend to overlook because you're kind of depicted as a being of a specific sort, and you're not even aware that you're constantly going and shifting through specific moods, that's one thing. And but saying then that you really should be just following along this is dreadful, in my opinion. You know, it is precisely the capacity to recognize, to know, and also then to more freely modify these affective components. This is where true wisdom lies. It's not, you know, recognizing that there is this domain and then what, you're just going to go into this. It is, to my mind, equally wrong than, for example, what you see sometimes when people talk about embodiment, and then now we're going to be embodied, and then you have these weird, bizarre exercises where people just do random stuff with their body. That's not being embodied. That's like utterly disembodied, in my opinion, because you have a bunch of academics who are walking around and doing strange movements, and this is somehow being embodied. No, this is not being embodied. Being embodied is mastering a certain skill to the point where you're basically so proficient at it that you're able to know what's going on while you're doing it, and it's extremely complex. But this is what it means to be truly embodied, not just doing random stuff. You know, this has nothing whatsoever to do with embodiment.
What exercise would you recommend, Sebastian, if an academic would want to get more aware of their embodiment?
I don't know. You know, this basically. No, the thing is, I would just recommend just, you know, that there are so many. I don't think that there's necessarily one solution or that would fit all, but just get into some sort of, you know, physical routine of some sort. Start doing something and cultivate it, like truly cultivate it. Get to know that particular activity and, you know, reflect upon it and try to get good at it and learn, see the whole process. There's no slow way of doing it. And the problem is, once you start thinking that, you know, embodiment means basically you're going to now get somehow completely out of your mind or reason to some pristine domain of corporeality. this is not the way you are in the world. You know, regardless of what you are, there's like an ongoing awareness going on, and there are layers to this and levels to it. But if you really want to understand these dimensions, you won't be able to understand them without actually developing certain patterns. So, you know, the body does certain things in specific ways. It has like certain preferential movements that it likes to do, and that kind of usually it will do. Well, just explore them. I don't care how. Go and do martial arts. Martial arts are great for that, but also just like regular calisthenics or some sort of something with relation to that, you know, and just combine it. Do calisthenics, do resistance training, what have you. These are all different ways where you learn to kind of do things with your body. For example, if you do gymnastics, you really get a good sense for your own body. You do judo, you get a good impression of what it means to use your body in relation to some other person. And I'm specifically mentioning judo, or you might also mention Brazilian jiu-jitsu, because you really have like this, you know, like close grip, and every small movement on the part of the other requires you to move. And of course, you can also do this in dancing, but for example, in martial arts, it becomes all the more acute, because it's not just about it looking good and feeling good, but you know, you don't want to be choked, or you don't want to get, you know, your arm in a strange position where you have to tap out. So it becomes like very, very pregnant, very, very important. And if you're doing it reflectively, it adds a specific layer. Yeah. So this is what I would recommend. This is embodied. Like, learn to do a certain pattern and observe what it means to acquire a certain pattern, and then learn what it means to do it extremely well. You know, how do you acquire a mastery of that? This, I would say, is embodiment.
That's one thing I would add here is also, of course, something that's not typically presented as being very embodied. Meditative practices, those are extremely embodied, especially Vipassana type practices, which do sort of qualitatively change the way one can attend to the body. Sort of it can expand, it can make it more salient in a way. And I don't know, for me, I think there's also kind of an interesting interplay between meditation, specifically in Zen, and resistance training, because I think, you know, of course, specifically in Zen, where you have to, you know, pay attention to posture and everything. I don't know. For me, I think it helped me learn to be more aware of my posture when doing a deadlift, for example. I think this, you know, it's similar, but it applies to almost any kind of pursuit, like playing a musical instrument. I think another very good example, because once you, I don't know, you can in a way dissociate, distinguish different, not only preferential movements, but types of doing movements. Because like when you're playing something that's really fast, you cannot attend to every single movement. You know, if you try to even notice, like, of course, that takes a lot of practice to be able to play something. At the start, you have to do that. You know, if you're just starting to learn Flight of the Bumblebee, you know, you got to pay attention to every bloody note. But when you get it down, like, it's impossible for you to attend to one single note, even, you know, in isolation in any respect, because if you do that, you know, it immediately derails the whole thing. So that there's some kind of a flow that you can't interrupt, where a complex of movements becomes in a way one movement. Or like, I don't know, again with the guitar, tremolo picking, or picking, you know, really fast. It's not which is of course especially like black metal or some genres, especially prevalent. It's like you're not doing individual movements. You can't. It's qualitatively different, and that even that thing, I suppose it could also apply to, I don't know, if you're trying to click a computer mouse really fast or something, or play a blast beat on it on the drums. It's not like you're doing individual movements at all. You're sort of creating a specific state of tension, which then resolves in doing very fast movements. And you can modulate the frequency very accurately, but you're not modulating individual movements.
This is a fabulous way of presenting things, because precisely I would say that the embodiment is more related to this capacity to inhabit a certain domain, like a certain, you know, what you need to acquire is a certain capacity of patterning, a very distinct patterning. So you learn to make certain distinctions that eventually kind of are integrated into a whole. I haven't used the term yet, so I'm going to use it now. Gestalt. Yeah. So it was just a matter of time. So and this is the deal of it. And I think that the more, you know, the more different domains or different ways of doing this you explore or allow yourself to explore, and you know, you can approach them with an inquisitive mind, where you do, for example, you can do what is sometimes called soft training, such as Qigong, for instance, and you have a very specific way of doing things. And then you have the more hard training, where you do like proper martial art thing. And what Adnan basically said with regards to playing an instrument holds true for, you know, if you're sparring with someone. In a certain sense, it's like a match. It's like a melody that has to unfold. If it's done properly, it's like something that happens, that has to go on constantly. Yeah, and it has a very specific rhythm and dynamics. And what basically, you know, what you have to learn is that nobody will be able to just throw constantly punches at you. There are specific rhythms where people do something and then they have to stop, and you learn to recognize the pauses, and when you do back, and you learn to recognize what a certain movement on the other side means for you to do something. So, you know, this is it's not just going around and randomly just kind of do weird stuff you would not normally do, and this is anchoring somehow. But I forgot, how did we even get here? This was just like a parallel that I used for something else, right? And then
At least I think everything you just said at the end also applies to having a conversation, like right? And I think this can be also a moment of meta-awareness of how this conversation is the resolution of a certain tension with a back and forth and pauses and an exchange. And
yes,
yeah.
and that's also why, for example, when it comes to the realm of the mental or what have you, you know, and somebody wants to say, I want to be embodied, well, go and have a Socratic dialogue, or just dialogue, like a proper dialogue, and you're kind of exercising embodiment. Yeah, because this is like the minded mode of being, the minded mode of being in the world. It's way more, you're doing it way more properly than doing some random stuff. Like that can have its merits. That can have its merits in the sense of just, you know, recognizing, I don't know, different parts of yourself or whatnot. But it's not, I don't see that it's really has much to do with embodiment per se.
It feels then maybe like when people say we have to reconnect with the body, it's like a nostalgia to the chimp era of man, like going back to being chimpanzees in the trees.
Yeah, but if you look about it, like the chimpanzees, the what they're doing, that's one integrated kinetic melody. There's none of that stuff. You know, none of that strange stuff. So like acquiring very specific pattern and domains, but like you said, it's just there's often this undertone of this idea that you have to kind of exclude intellect and reflection. But to my mind, the reason why this is being pressed is because usually the way that reasoning is being conducted and understood is in a very specific way that usually has little to do with yourself as an existential whole. So for instance, you have people going to very specific places we call schools, and they do all kinds of stuff there that most of them, 90% of them, see almost no relation whatsoever to what's happening in their daily lives. You know, the fallings in love, the breakings up, the talking badly about someone, the all the other stuff that you do. And usually when you talk about reasoning, when you revert to reasoning, you revert to doing something like that. This is what reasoning is to use, like a very instrumental practice, a very instrumental practice that seems to be dry. And if what happens after a while is you lose the capacity of meta-awareness of thinking itself and the capacity to govern your own thinking. And when thinking happens, thinking thinks you, there's no capacity for you to do the disciplined thinking because you've never done that. You know, when you enter the classroom, nobody said the following. The teacher will not say, here's an equation on the table, who is going to solve it? And then Atul, because Atul is a smart guy, immediately starts solving the equation. And the professor says, Atul, why the heck did you do this? I just came to this classroom, I wrote something on the table, and you started solving it. You're going to waste 15 to 20 minutes maybe solving this. This is 15 to 20 minutes of your life. Have you ever paused and asked a question? Which questions do I really want to devote this time to? Nobody teaches you to do this. They say thinking is, if I do this, you do this. So this is the thinking construed in this manner is thinking within a certain framework, but it's not thinking between frameworks or even the recognition that there are frameworks and that you can learn to break through them or become aware of them by, you know, for instance, switching from one framework to another. So thinking, like I said at the very beginning, can mean very different things, and usually it's construed very narrowly, like very instrumentally. Normally, because that's the way that's how the term is used, and you basically are kind of brought up with that. Yeah.
I mean, apart from the question of to what extent it would be possible to teach everyone framework switching in the same way, at least. Apart from that, when you mentioned, I just have to say, when you mentioned academics doing weird stuff, I mean, words cannot capture my disappointment and surprise and utter disgust when I found out how words such as embodiment and lived experience are mostly used outside of phenomenological circles. It's yeah, looking up publications and stuff with those words, not a good experience. So yeah, do not recommend that to anyone.
It's become a battle cry, I would say, nowadays. Like when you want to react to a certain something, these are the go-to terms. They're very powerful. They're very like brimming with evocative like connotations, emotive connotations. And yeah, they also have this element of both nostalgia and utopia, like two things at the same time. You're like nostalgic for a certain Adamic state, so something that's very pristine and pure, and at the same time it's utopian in the sense of, you know, it calls for a different way of being which is at odds with the current state. And you know what we have now is kind of oppressive in so many different ways, so breaking through and leading to something. So yeah, it can be used in many different ways, and I'm also not particularly keen on some of these developments, but they are also they are useful terms. Yeah, so it's worth they're worth fighting for.
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree on that. My surprise was only when I was looking them up in, you know, sort of just Googling stuff without reference to a particular body of work. And, you know, I understand why those terms are so appealing to different audiences, but you know, I do have to say that with some of the contemporary art exhibitions and stuff that have that use those terms, I don't see. I personally fail to see why they would be pristine, pure, or Adamic. Yeah, those would not be the first words that would come to mind. But yeah, that's a bit of a sidetrack there.
Yeah. Anybody else want to chime in on this?
I'm actually just curious what you found, Adnan. Like, what is it that evoked the utter disgust?
I mean, it's
I have some ideas of my own, but
You're opening a can of worms here, I think.
I know
Yeah,
I was afraid to ask the
it-
question, but I
Yeah.
had to.
It's not just one thing in particular, but you know, like art installations, and I use that word in a highly inappropriate sense here, where, you know, which consists of people doing random stuff, like, I don't know, standing somewhere wrapped in toilet paper, like, you know, the most random stuff that you can think of. And that's, of course, when it somehow miraculously manages to not be obscene as well, because it has an interesting tendency to do that. So I was deliberately using a candid example, but yeah, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, in this particular sense, this is where I think that this utopian / revolutionary aspect is underscored. You know, the idea just to live experience as that we have to break through this idea of breaking through something. Yeah, so breaking through the boundaries, the norms, the what have you. And yeah, it's becoming more and more, I would say, used in many different ways, and very often it has these connotations. You know, it either has it has both of those elements, I feel, as is usually the case with anything like this. Yeah, it's just like trying to get to something that is more genuine, more real, stuff like that.
Might be better ways of doing that than wrapping yourself in toilet paper, but yeah.
Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
For example.
Yeah.
There's two kinds of people, eh?
To tie things back to the essay that we were discussing today. Yeah, a few final thoughts that I had were it's very interesting how he also links this power of vision, this distance that vision acquires to light, to the properties of light itself. Like how light can travel far is, in a sense, weightless, reflecting off everything. And so what that made me think is that there is also a contact happening there, like with touch, right? So with touch, there is this pressure, and with light, there is also a pressure, but it's neutralized. So that immediate contact doesn't play a role in the phenomenal content. It just mediates it in a way. And then what we get are the objects themselves instead of the contact that is actually taking place. But then to add the nuance that I feel Merleau-Ponty brings into it is that it doesn't neutralize it entirely, because your gaze isn't free to move around the scene. It is bound to the contours. It is bound to certain zones of color. And so there is still this binding taking place between the gaze and the environment. It just has much more mobility and much more space to explore compared to touch. And yeah, I guess that is that was some final reflections I had, tying together parts of this conversation, and also of the nuance that I felt was missing a bit. There was a question somewhere at the end of it, but I lost the question, so I'll just leave it with the comment.
With regards to light, maybe just a very brief comment. What I found, I don't know if you've noticed this as well, but I found it here. I found it slightly not confusing. That's too strong of a word, but maybe equivocal in the sense of that he was talking about it sometimes as if from a phenomenological perspective, but then also he would switch to the physical, you know, that it moves faster than everything. I mean, maybe it's also phenomenological because, you know, as soon as you switch on or off, it's just like immediately there. But also just the notions that he was using, like causality and this speed, the way he was talking about it.
Be a trend in Jonas, right?
Yeah, a bit of a trend. So one thing, you know, when I read some of these texts is, I'm pretty sure that if he were to deliver this as a talk and we were there, and if you were to ask him, you know, he would probably give a really good answer. So what a huge, enormous pity it is that this is no longer possible. Because, you know, sometimes you read a certain author and you have the impression that some authors reach a certain point where, so for instance, I was just rereading the text, which I've reread I don't know how many times now, but not one, not two, by Varela. Yeah. And there are certain segments where, unlike with Jonas, I have the impression that if I were to ask him, he would not be able to answer in a way that would be necessarily clear, because you have the impression that he reached a certain level where things are confusing for him. With Jonas, I don't have this impression. I don't have this impression that if you were to press him, he would be able to give you an account as to, you know, how you are supposed to read something or position yourself, or where he was awkward or something, because it's a different type of not error, but a different type of equivocality. Whereas with Varela, you know, he kind of reaches a certain point and he's trying to articulate something, and you see that he's doing it from different angles, and you see that he hasn't really found yet the completely right one. Whichever one he kind of takes, there's something is about to snap. So he's trying a different angle, and there's something else is about to snap. So he hasn't been able to find like a really good entryway that would be that would allow for equilibrium. With Jonas, you have these tensions. You don't have the impression that it's going to snap, and you have the impression that very quickly he would be able to calibrate. So this is a huge pity. It would be really, really good to kind of probe him on this causality and the light.
Because when he talks about causality here, of like vision neutralizing causality, or how touch is blending together force with sensation, he's not talking about force in the sense of a physicist directly, I would think. And at the same time, he does move back and forth to the physicist conception of these properties. So
maybe before we wrap this up, what would be a kind, benevolent reading of this? The most benevolent. How would we make a case for Jonas? One thought that popped to my mind is that you might say that, you know, the notion of, say, a force or a cause or something is eventually drawn from phenomenology. So you can do these types of moves and shifts because ultimately you are kind of working from the same background.
exactly. So I thought like the first word that came to mind when you asked it was the notion of fundirung.
Yeah.
That one is founding the other, and that science is simply giving explicit expression to latent forces of experience.
What an elegant way to basically immediately just say, you know what, people, you know, guys and gals, you're making too much of a big deal out of this. It's very simple. Fundierung. Go read logische Untersuchungen. It's at the very beginning of phenomenology. Yeah, okay. I mean, I thought that today we were going to actually have a shorter discussion, but it turned out that we were engaged in proper, hardcore, orthodox, speculative investigation of the dynamics of various senses. I actually quite liked it because it was so kind of open, like these open spaces you don't normally get to explore. It's usually more kind of constrained, but here we just went off the deep end.
Good. It was good. I like the themes we touched upon. We didn't get
Yeah,
to
and you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say I also really liked it today, and I think I don't know the fact there's fewer of us. If anything, it can sort of make it easier for things to go in this direction, because when there are more people, you sort of don't want to go off on a tangent too much, because maybe someone has something to say that's more directly related to the text or something. So yeah, I think that I also don't have anything against the online format, even if there aren't that many people.
But the thing is, what I found particularly interesting is that we try to kind of stick to the topic, and then we usually get off on a tangent. We usually kind of start with a topic and then just go somewhere. But here, we were just really going at it from like very speculative perspectives. Well, I think we were more on top than ever so far. Like we were most closely following the text than in any previous session.
Yeah, that's a good point. We're just doing it dialectically, I suppose.
Yeah, and also with a lot of speculative pirouettes.
No, yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
Yeah, Atul, a really good presentation, by the way, really, and also like aesthetically very pleasing.
Thank you.
So
I
it was
I spent good time searching for the right images, so I'm happy. It's appreciated.
Yeah,
Very
it
good,
was
very-
beautiful.
yeah, really
The
good,
chapter
really.
about the site was perfect.
Yeah, very good, nicely done. Okay, then in 2 weeks, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Till then, be well.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.